Rafael sat alone in the small office, a room once full of life, now filled with a suffocating silence. He stared at the papers in front of him. Contracts, invoices, bills, nothing else made sense. Everything that had once been his pride and passion was crumbling before his eyes. The restaurant he had built with so much effort and love, Sabores do Coração, would have its doors. How did I get to this point, he wondered, his chest clenched by the weight of guilt. He had failed everyone, his employees who trusted him, the customers who came to the restaurant for more than food, and most of all, he was able to do so. Rafael stood up, his body exhausted, as if carrying the weight of years on his back. He needed to face what came next. He called a meeting with all employees. As they gathered in the main hall, Rafael tried to keep his cool, but his eyes betrayed the despair he felt. "I don't know how to say this," he began, his voice choked with emotion, "but unfortunately, we're going to have to close the restaurant. In a week's time, Sabores do Coração will cease to exist. We did everything we could, but..." The shock was visible on the surrounding faces. Some employees already knew that things were not going well, but hearing the confirmation from Rafael's mouth was devastating. A tear ran down the face of Sofia, the young waitress who had started there as an intern and AG. Rafael took a deep breath, trying to compose himself. "I want you to know that I will do my best to make sure that everyone gets what they deserve. I have failed you, but I will do what I can to correct this." His words, although sincere, did not ease the weight he felt in his chest. The silence that followed was heavy, as if the air had been. After the announcement, the employees slowly dispersed. Some were still trying to understand what had happened, while others, like Sofia, just quietly withdrew. Rafael returned to his office, where everything seemed suffocating. He sat down in the chair, letting his head fall in his hands, and the memories of him. He remembered when he first opened the restaurant. It had been a dream, a place where people not only ate, but shared stories, laughed, and bonded. He knew most of the customers by name, knew their preferences, and made sure that each dish was made with care and dedication. But things had changed. Sales began to fall and costs grew. Trying to save the restaurant, he trusted someone who promised financial help, but it was all a trap. The coup left him deep in debt, and now he was there, ready to. The office door opened softly and Clara, the restaurant manager, entered. There was something in his eyes that showed understanding, but also pain. "You did everything you could, Rafael," she said in a soft tone, sitting down in front of him. "I know how much this place means to you." Rafael smiled sadly. "It doesn't seem enough. I should have been more careful. I let them all sink." Clara shook her head, her eyes full of empathy. "You trusted people. This is not a failure, Rafael. It's a quality. Unfortunately, not everyone deserves this co." There was a moment of silence between them, where words were not necessary. Clara knew that Rafael was broken inside, and he knew that somehow she understood his pain. She stood up and, before leaving, lightly touched his shoulder. "We still have a week. Let's make it the best pos. Quando fico sozinho novamente, Rafael alhueo redder. As paredes do escritorio estavam cheias de fotos, recordicos dos bons momentos, dos primeros dias de sucesso. Era impossible neo esse center esmagado pelo peso das memorias e pelo fracasso que parecia estar estampado em cada canto daquela sala. E ele suspira profundamente, fecho os olhos por instante, permisso-se sonhar com o que poderia ter sido. Mas a realidade logo o puxa de volta. Havia decisões difíceis a serem tomadas, e o tempo estava acabando. Naquela noite, enquanto caminhava pelas ruas desertas da cidade, a mente Rafael não parava de revisitar cada erro, cada momento em que ele poderia ter tomado uma decisão diferente. O vento frio da noite soprava em esse rosto, mas o verdadeiro frio vinha de dentro. A sensação de ter decepcionado não apenas a si mesmo, mas também todos ao seu redor, era insupportable. He looked at the windows of the other restaurants that were still glowing in the night. People laughing, families reunited, and he wondered if he would ever experience that joy, that sense of belonging that his restaurant had brought him. When he got home, Rafael threw himself on the couch, exhausted. He rested his head on his hands and let the tears finally escape. It was the first time in a long time that he had allowed himself to feel the full weight of his loss. Failure consumed him, but deep down, something inside him still pulsated. Something small, a spark of hope, that he couldn't. Perhaps, he thought, even in the midst of the chaos, there was still something to fight for. The cold night seemed endless as Rafael walked through the almost deserted streets of the city. His steps were heavy, his body exhausted, but his mind could not rest. All he could think about was the imminent end of Flavors of the Heart. He was about to lose everything he had built. Everything he had worked for years was falling apart in his hands, and he felt helpless. It was then that a soft, sad sound broke the silence of the night. A cry. Rafael stopped, his heart tightening when he heard that sound. It came from a narrow and dark alley. For a moment, he hesitated. I was tired, emotionally destroyed, but something inside him impelled him to follow the sound. As he approached, Rafael saw a scene that made him feel a tightness in his chest. A woman was sitting against the brick wall, holding in her arms a small girl who was crying softly. The woman, visibly dejected, caressed her daughter's hair, trying to calm her down, but the tiredness and despair were clear in her eyes. "I'm hungry, Mom," murmured the girl, in a weak voice. The woman, with an overwhelming sadness in her eyes, replied softly, "I know, dear, but we don't have food right now. Maybe tomorrow." Rafael felt his heart break when he saw the scene. He knew that kind of desperation. It wasn't the physical hunger he had already experienced, but the despair of not knowing how to offer something to the one he loves. He stood there for a moment, silently, watching. The girl continued to cry, and the mother, helpless, tried to console her daughter with empty words because she knew that there was nothing she could do. Suddenly, a man passed through the alley. The woman, in a last act of hope, stretched out her hand and asked in a low voice, "Lord, can you please help us with something to eat?" The man cast a quick, cold glance at the woman and her daughter, without even stopping to listen. Muttering contemptuously, he said something cruel as he walked away. "These ones are only using the child to get money." Rafael felt an anger rise in his throat when he heard those words. How could anyone be so insensitive? How could anyone look at a mother and her daughter in such despair and simply ignore it? He knew he couldn't leave. He knew he wouldn't be able to sleep knowing he left that scene behind without doing something. Taken by a sudden decision, Rafael turned and hurriedly walked back to his restaurant, feeling a new determination take over his body. When he arrived at the Flavors of the Heart, he quickly entered. The lights were still off, but he knew every corner of that place like the back of his hand. Without thinking twice, he went to the kitchen and started preparing something simple but nutritious. He warmed up loaves, prepared a hot soup, and carefully placed it all in a bag. As he did this, something inside him changed. The restaurant was about to close, and he had no way to save what he had built. But in that moment, he realized he could still make a difference. Maybe not in the way he envisioned when he started Flavors of the Heart, but in a way that was still meaningful. He could bring a little comfort to someone who needed it. Back in the alley, Rafael found the mother and daughter still in the same place. The girl was huddled in her mother's arms, her eyes closed, exhausted from crying. The woman looked up as she saw him approaching, with an expression of surprise and hope. "I brought this to you," Rafael said, holding out the bag to the woman. "There's bread, hot soup. It's not much, but it will help." The woman looked at him with tears in her eyes, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. Finally, his voice came out, trembling and full of emotion. "Thank you very much. I don't know how to thank you. May God bless you." The girl, now awake, smiled faintly at the sight of the bread. Rafael knelt down to stand at her height and, with a gentle smile, said, "You can eat a lot. It will do you good." The child, his eyes shining with relief and gratitude, began to eat. Rafael observed the scene with a lump in his throat. He hadn't solved the big problems in their lives, but in that moment, he felt that he had done something important. His mother, still moved, looked at him and murmured, "You are an angel." "I have no words to thank you." Rafael just shook his head. "Be well," he said in a soft but emotionally charged voice. He knew he couldn't save the world, but he could help one person at a time. As he walked back to his car, sadness over the restaurant's closure still weighed on him. But at that moment, something changed. A gentle warmth filled his heart. The simple act of helping someone in need brought a glow of humanity that he thought he had lost. As much as he was facing a great failure, the feeling of having done something good that night gave him a new lease of life. Sometimes, he thought, maybe it's not the big gestures that change the world, but the small acts of kindness. And on that cold night, Rafael felt that, despite all his flaws, there was still something inside him that was worth it. In the days that followed that night, Rafael found himself torn between the weight of the restaurant's imminent demise and the memory of the mother and daughter he had helped. Although he knew that the days of sabores do coração were numbered, the act of kindness he had practiced did not leave his mind. It was as if, in the midst of the chaos of her life, that gesture had lit a small flame of hope. A reminder that even when everything seems to fall apart, there is still room to make a difference. However, the restaurant was still empty. The customers, who had once filled the tables and brought life to the place, were now far away, and the hall seemed like an echo of better times. The days passed like a blur, and the inevitable approached. Rafael was aware that, no matter how hard he tried, the end was getting closer and closer. Clara, his manager, noticed Rafael's growing melancholy. She was always practical, work-focused, but she also had a generous heart. "Rafael," she said one morning, as she approached him in the empty hall, "I've been thinking, we still have enough stock for a few more days. What do you think about postponing the closure of the restaurant for another week? It would be a waste to let this food spoil." Rafael looked at Clara, surprised by the suggestion. He knew that postponing the inevitable would not change the outcome. But there was something in his words that made him pause for reflection. Perhaps those extra days could mean more than he realized. "How long do we have exactly in stock?" asked Rafael, a little skeptical. Clara shrugged. 3, 4 days at most. If we plan well, we can serve a few more people. Besides, she paused, looking him straight in the eye. This place means so much to all of us. Closing at once seems raw. Maybe this extra time will give us a chance to say goodbye with more dignity. Rafael sighed. He knew that Clara was right. The restaurant was more than a business. It was a family, a refuge for its employees and customers. Okay, he finally agreed. "We will postpone the closure for another 3 days." Clara smiled, and Rafael realized how much that decision, even small, brought a brief relief to his heart. At least, for a few more days, sabores do coração would continue to exist. However, Rafael still carried the weight of failure on his back. He constantly wondered if there was anything he could have done differently. The memories of financial mistakes, the trust placed in people who betrayed him, all of this still consumed him. And in the midst of these thoughts, the images of that mother and her daughter constantly returned to her mind. He didn't know their names. I didn't know where they came from, or where they were going. But he knew that as he faced the end of a dream, they faced a much more vicious struggle, the battle for daily survival. He wondered if he had met them again, if they were all right, or if the cold of that night had led them to some darker fate. His curiosity became uncontrollable. 3 days after helping them, Rafael decided to return to that alley, hoping to find them again. He knew he couldn't change their world, but maybe he could offer more than a meal. Perhaps it could give them some kind of more lasting relief. Upon arriving at the scene, Rafael's heart raced when he saw that the mother and daughter were still there. They were in the same corner, huddled against the brick wall, shielding themselves from the cold with a thin, worn blanket. The mother's countenance was even more haggard than before. His eyes, once tired, now seemed empty of any hope. The girl was lying on her mother's lap, her lips pale and her face marked by cold and hunger. Rafael knelt next to them, feeling a pang of sadness when he realized how much the situation had worsened in such a short time. "You're still here?" Rafael said softly, his voice broken with emotion. The woman looked at him with surprise, recognizing him immediately. "Sir, you're back," she muttered, her voice faint.
I
"I didn't expect to see you again." Rafael shook his head, looking at the sleeping girl. "I couldn't leave them like this. You need more than a meal." He helped his mother up, and together, they walked to her car. Without hesitation, he took them back to the restaurant. When they arrived, Clara found them at the entrance, surprised by their presence. Rafael quickly explained the situation, and Clara, always practical and supportive, immediately agreed to help. "We can find a way," she said, leading the mother and daughter to the staff kitchen. "I'm going to prepare something hot for you to eat. Make yourself comfortable." The mother looked at Rafael with eyes full of gratitude, unable to hold back her tears. "I don't know how to thank you. That means everything to us." Rafael just smiled, with a mixture of joy and sadness in his heart. He knew the restaurant was on the verge of closing, but at that moment, none of that mattered. What really mattered was that he could make a difference, however small, in the life of someone in need. While Clara prepared the meal, Rafael watched in silence. The aroma of the food, the familiar noise of the kitchen, all of this reconnected him with the essence of the restaurant, with the reason why he had created Sabores do Coração. It wasn't just about business or profits. It was about taking care of people. And in that moment, he remembered it. While the mother and daughter were eating, Rafael felt a relief, a peace that he had not felt for a long time. He may not be able to save the restaurant, but there was still time to save something bigger, his life's purpose. The days following Rafael's decision to help the mother and daughter were a strange mix of melancholy and purpose. The Sabores do Coração was still scheduled to close, but Rafael's focus had shifted slightly. He wasn't just a man awaiting the end of his dream anymore. He was a man who had made a difference, however small, in the lives of two people in desperate need. Word spread quickly among the staff about what Rafael had done. Clara, always efficient and deeply invested in the restaurant's future, had taken it upon herself to organize things. She made sure the woman, Anna, and her daughter, Luisa, were comfortable. The two had been given a small corner in the back of the restaurant where they could rest for a few days. Rafael knew it wasn't a permanent solution, but for the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't focusing solely on the ticking clock that counted down the restaurant's final days. Clara approached him one morning while he sat in the dim light of his office, reviewing the paperwork that had piled up. The financial documents, the legal notices, everything that confirmed the end was inevitable. Yet, there was something different in Clara's demeanor today. Her usual no-nonsense attitude was softened by a quiet determination. "Rafael," she began, sitting down across from him. "I've been thinking." He looked up, the fatigue etched in his features evident. "About what?" Clara took a breath before continuing. "We've been given a little more time here. The restaurant still has a few days left. What if we use that time for something meaningful? Not just to serve the last meals, but to make these final days something people will remember. Maybe this place can still have an impact, even if it's not financially successful." Rafael leaned back in his chair, considering her words. He wanted to protest, to say that it was too late for that the debts were too high, and that nothing they did now would change the inevitable. But the hope in Clara's eyes was contagious. "What do you suggest?" he asked, not fully committing but curious. Clara leaned forward, her voice quiet but filled with resolve. "We invite people to come, not just for the food, but for the stories. Anna, she's been through so much, and her story, well, it's powerful. You saw it yourself. What if, in these final days, we make this place not just a restaurant, but a place where people connect, where stories are told, and where everyone who walks through those doors feels like they're part of something bigger?" Rafael sat in silence, absorbing the idea. It sounded almost naive, but at the same time, it was beautiful. It was the kind of thing he had dreamed of when he first opened the restaurant. A place where food was just part of the experience, where the real value came from the connections made between people. "You think people will come?" Rafael asked, his voice quieter now, almost afraid to hope. Clara nodded. "I think they will. Anna has a way of drawing people in." She has a warmth about her that can't be faked. And after what we've seen these last few days, I believe this place can still matter." There was a long pause as Rafael considered her words. He looked at the financial reports scattered across his desk, at the reminder of everything that was crumbling around him. But for the first time in weeks, there was a flicker of something else, something like hope. Maybe this wasn't the end he had imagined, but it didn't have to be a failure. "All right," he said finally, his voice steady. "Let's do it. Let's give people something to remember." Clara smiled, a small but genuine smile. "I knew you'd see it that way." They immediately set to work. Clara spread the word among the staff, and soon everyone was buzzing with a new plan. Anna, who had been quietly staying in the back with Luisa, was brought into the fold. At first, she seemed hesitant, unsure if she wanted to share her personal story with strangers. But after a private conversation with Rafael, where he assured her that no one was expecting her to bare her soul, just to share what she felt comfortable with, she agreed. "I don't know how much my story will help," Anna said softly, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "It already helped me," Rafael replied, his voice sincere. "And I think it'll help others too. You don't have to do this, Anna. But if you're willing, I think it could be something special." Anna looked down at her hands, then back up at Rafael. "I'll do it." The first night of the new plan was met with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. Rafael wasn't sure what to expect. The dining room had been arranged differently, with the tables closer together, creating a more intimate atmosphere. Candles were lit, casting a soft glow over the room. There was a tension in the air, not of fear, but of anticipation. The staff worked quickly and quietly, preparing the meals while Anna, standing in the center of the room, began to speak. Her voice was soft at first, hesitant, but as she continued, it gained strength. She told the story of how she had ended up on the streets with her daughter, of the struggles they had faced, and of the small acts of kindness that had kept them going. The room fell silent as people listened, captivated not just by the food, but by the humanity behind it. And when she finished, the room erupted in applause. It wasn't the applause of a crowd who had just enjoyed a performance. It was the applause of people who had connected, who had felt something real. Rafael stood at the back of the room, watching it all unfold. His heart swelled with emotion. This was what he had always wanted for Sabores do Corazon. Not just a place to eat, but a place where people could feel like they were part of something greater. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. As the night came to an end, Rafael approached Anna. "You were incredible tonight," he said, his voice full of gratitude. Anna smiled, a tired but genuine smile. "I just told the truth, and that's what made it so powerful," Rafael replied. That night, as Rafael locked up the restaurant, he realized that even though Sabores do Corazon would close its doors soon, its legacy would live on in ways he hadn't anticipated. This wasn't just about food, it was about connection, about kindness, about hope. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid of the future. The new life that had blossomed in flavors of the heart over the past few days brought a bittersweet feeling to Rafael's heart. The restaurant, which had been on the verge of closing, had found a renewed sense of purpose. Anna's stories, intertwined with the food they served, had transformed the once empty dining room into a sanctuary of connection. People didn't come just for the meals. They came for the warmth, for the humanity that radiated from Anna as she shared her past, and from Rafael's team, who poured their hearts into every dish. But in the back of Rafael's mind, the reality still loomed. The restaurant's debts were too large, and no amount of stories could change the financial hole that had been dug. Flavors of the heart would close. It was only a matter of time. Rafael sat in his office, the familiar stacks of unpaid bills cluttering his desk. Each day, more people came to the restaurant, hoping to experience what had become something magical, yet the money they earned wasn't enough to reverse the damage already done. His heart ached with the knowledge that, despite everything, this rebirth was temporary. As he stared out the window, lost in thought, a soft knock echoed at the door. It was Clara. She entered quietly, her usual confident demeanor replaced with something gentler, as if she could sense the weight Rafael was carrying. "Hey," she said softly, closing the door behind her. "You've been in here for a while." I thought you could use a break. Rafael sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair. I'm just trying to figure out what comes next, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. No matter how good things have been lately, it's not going to be enough. We can't save the restaurant. Clara walked over and sat down across from him. I know, she admitted, her tone gentle but firm. But these last few days, Rafael, look at what you've created. This place became more than just a restaurant again. It became what you always wanted it to be. A place where people feel at home, where they connect with each other. Rafael looked at her, the frustration and pain clear in his eyes. But it's all ending, Clara. We'll close, and all of this will be gone. I don't know how to deal with that. Clara leaned forward, her voice filled with quiet resolve. It won't be gone. People will remember what this place stood for. Even if the doors close, you've touched their lives. Isn't that what you set out to do? Her words, though simple, struck a chord in Rafael. He had opened flavors of the heart not to chase wealth, but to create a place where people could come together, share stories, and find comfort in each other's company. Somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of that. But now, in these final days, he had rediscovered the heart of what truly mattered. I don't know what's going to happen after this, Rafael admitted, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know what I'll do when we close. Clara reached out, placing a hand on his arm. You'll figure it out. You've built something beautiful here, Rafael. Whatever comes next, you'll carry that with you. And you won't be alone. Her words hung in the air, and Rafael looked at her, truly seeing the compassion in her eyes. He realized then how much Clara had been by his side, not just as a manager, but as a friend, someone who believed in him even when he had lost faith in himself. Thank you, he whispered, his voice barely steady. I don't know if I've said that enough. For everything, Clara smiled softly. You don't have to thank me, Rafael. I'm just glad I've been a part of this. Their quiet moment was interrupted by the sound of Anna's voice from the dining room. Rafael could hear her gentle storytelling, captivating the crowd that had gathered once again to hear her speak. Her words flowed through the restaurant like a balm, soothing and warm. And as Rafael listened, he felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. He stood up, glancing toward the dining room door. I need to be out there, he said, more to himself than to Clara. Clara nodded, standing with him. You belong out there. Together, they left the office and entered the dining room, where the atmosphere was vibrant and alive. Anna stood in the center of the room, her voice calm and steady as she shared another chapter of her life. Luisa, her daughter, sat at a nearby table, her small hands wrapped around a warm bowl of soup, her eyes fixed on her mother with admiration. The room was packed with customers, many of them regulars who had returned after hearing about the stories being told. Others were new faces, drawn by the whispers of something extraordinary happening at Flavors of the Heart. The sense of community in the air was palpable, and as Rafael walked through the crowd, he was greeted with smiles, nods, and murmurs of appreciation. Anna's story ended, and the room broke into soft applause. As she stepped aside, allowing the diners to return to their meals, she spotted Rafael. She walked over to him, her face lit with gratitude. Thank you, Rafael, Anna said quietly, her eyes shining with emotion. I can't tell you what this has meant to me and Luisa. Rafael shook his head, his own voice tight with emotion. You don't need to thank me, Anna. You've done more for this place in the past few days than I ever could have imagined. Anna smiled softly. Maybe, but you gave us a chance. You gave us a place to be safe. That's something I'll never forget. As the night wore on, Rafael felt a bittersweet mix of emotions. He knew the restaurant's days were numbered, but he had come to accept that now. The love and warmth that filled the room, the stories shared, the lives touched, it all mattered. In those moments, he realized that Flavors of the Heart would leave behind a legacy, not because of the food, but because of the people who had made it their own. For the first time in weeks, Rafael felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel: peace. And though the future was uncertain, he knew that whatever came next, he would carry the spirit of Flavors of the Heart with him. The final night of Flavors of the Heart had arrived. The reality of it weighed heavily on Rafael as he stood in the dim light of the restaurant's kitchen. The hum of voices and clinking silverware filled the air, but tonight, everything felt different. There was a sense of finality, a bittersweet tone that colored every word spoken, every dish served. The dining room was full. Word had spread throughout the community about what was happening, how a small, once struggling restaurant had turned its last days into something magical. People had come not just to eat, but to be part of the story, to say goodbye. Rafael stood alone in the kitchen, the smells of roasted vegetables and freshly baked bread wafting around him. He felt a mix of emotions as Clara entered the room. She moved quietly, sensing the weight of the moment. "You've created something special, Rafael," Clara said softly, standing beside him. Her voice, though gentle, cut through the thick air of melancholy that filled the room. Rafael didn't respond immediately. He stared at the pot of simmering sauce in front of him, his mind replaying the years that had led to this moment. The highs, the lows, the moments of triumph, and the crushing weight of failure. And now the ending. "I thought I would feel proud," Rafael finally said, his voice raw with emotion. "But all I feel is loss." Clara watched him, her eyes soft with understanding.
"It's normal to feel that way.
You put your heart into this place. Losing it is like losing a part of yourself." Rafael swallowed hard, trying to fight back the sting of tears. He didn't want to break down, not tonight. Not when everyone else was celebrating the life of this place. "It just doesn't seem like enough," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "After everything, I couldn't save it." Clara shook her head, her tone gentle yet firm. "You didn't fail, Rafael. Look at all these people out there. They're here because this place meant something to them. It may be closing, but it left a mark. That's something no closure can erase." Rafael finally looked at her, his eyes heavy with unshed tears. "I just wanted it to last," he confessed, the weight of his emotions pouring out with those words. She smiled sadly. "And in a way, it will. People won't forget what you did here. This isn't the kind of place that just fades away. You created something more than a restaurant. You gave people a place to belong." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the weight of the night pressing down on both of them. Finally, Clara gave Rafael's arm a gentle squeeze and left the kitchen, leaving him alone with his thoughts once more. Rafael took a deep breath, steeling himself before walking out into the dining room. The sight that greeted him was overwhelming. Every table was full, people talking animatedly, enjoying their meals, unaware of how much it cost him to stand there and witness it all. The restaurant had never been this alive, this vibrant. And yet, here he was, watching its final moments unfold. At the far end of the room, Anna stood, telling one of her stories again. Her voice carried over the hum of the crowd, wrapping the room in warmth. She had become the heart of this place in the last few days. Her resilience, her openness, it had inspired everyone who walked through the doors. Rafael made his way through the tables, feeling the energy and excitement around him. When he reached Anna, she paused her story, offering him a soft smile. "How are you holding up?" she asked, her voice low, knowing how difficult this night must be for him. "I'm not sure," Rafael admitted, his voice thick. "But seeing all of this, it helps." Anna nodded, her eyes full of understanding. "You've given us something more than just food, Rafael. You gave us a place to belong. That's a gift not many people can give." Her words settled into Rafael's heart, heavy yet comforting. Maybe she was right. Maybe Flavors of the Heart had become something more than just a restaurant. It had become a place where people connected, shared stories, and found comfort in each other's presence. And perhaps that was more important than anything else. The night wore on, and as the final plates were cleared and the last customers said their goodbyes, Rafael stood by the door, shaking hands, offering tired but heartfelt smiles. Some people lingered, hesitant to leave, as if staying a little longer might delay the inevitable. Clara approached him as the last guests departed, the restaurant now quiet, its final echoes fading into the walls. "It's time," she said softly. Rafael nodded, his throat tight with emotion. The staff gathered around him. Anna, Luisa, Clara, and the others. Their faces were somber, but filled with gratitude. They all knew what this place had meant, and now, they stood together in its final moments. "I just want to say," Rafael began, his voice shaking slightly, "that no matter what happens next, this place, this family, we built something beautiful. I'm proud of each and every one of you." Tears welled in the eyes of his staff, and for a moment, no one spoke. The gravity of the moment settled over them all. They laughed softly, the tension breaking, and together, they began to clean the restaurant one final time. The lights dimmed, the chairs stacked, the kitchen falling into silence once more. As Rafael stood by the front door, key in hand, ready to lock it for the last time, he hesitated. He took one final look at the place that had been his dream for so long. It felt like saying goodbye to a part of himself, but there was peace in it now. He turned the key, the lock clicking softly in the stillness of the night. And with that, the door to Flavors of the Heart closed for the final time. The morning after the final night at Flavors of the Heart felt surreal. Rafael woke up with the sunlight streaming through his window, but instead of the usual rush of urgency and purpose that had driven him every day, there was only silence. No schedules, no orders, no bustling kitchen waiting for him. He lay there for a moment, the weight of it all pressing down on him. It was over. The restaurant, his dream, was now just a memory. Still, there was a strange sense of peace in the finality of it. The closure had been bittersweet, but it wasn't without meaning. The last few days had given him something more than just an ending. They had given him a glimpse of what truly mattered: connection, kindness, and the power of community. And perhaps that was more than enough. Rafael spent most of that morning lost in thought. He wandered through his apartment, his mind heavy with memories of the restaurant, the opening day, the laughter of customers, the challenges he faced, and the people who had become more like family than employees. But something about today felt different. The grief was there, yes, but it wasn't overwhelming. Instead, there was a quiet sense of hope, a feeling that this wasn't the end, but the beginning of something new. In the midst of his reflection, his phone buzzed. It was Clara. "Hey," she said when he picked up, her voice light and warm. "I know it's only been a day, but I was thinking, you should come out. Get some fresh air." Rafael chuckled softly. Clara had always been the practical one, the one who never let him wallow for too long. "What did you have in mind?" he asked, curiosity piqued. "There's this cafe I've been wanting to check out," she replied. "It's small, quiet, and they make a mean espresso. Meet me there in an hour." Rafael hesitated for a moment, the thought of facing the world outside feeling like an enormous task. But then he remembered the look on Clara's face as she stood by his side during the restaurant's final hours, steadfast, supportive. She had been his rock through it all. Maybe this was what he needed. "All right," he agreed, his voice lighter than he expected. "I'll see you there." An hour later, Rafael found himself walking down a quiet street toward the cafe Clara had mentioned. The air was crisp, and for the first time in weeks, he noticed the world around him. The way the trees swayed gently in the breeze, the laughter of a child running after a dog, the soft hum of a busy day unfolding around him. It was as if life was nudging him forward, reminding him that there was still so much more to experience beyond the walls of his restaurant. The cafe was tucked away on a corner, its exterior modest but inviting. When he walked in, the smell of freshly brewed coffee hit him, warming him from the inside out. Clara was already seated by a window, a small smile playing on her lips as she waved him over. "I was starting to think you wouldn't show," she teased as he sat down. "Almost didn't," Rafael admitted with a grin. "But I figured you wouldn't let me hear the end of it if I bailed." Clara laughed softly, her eyes bright with amusement. "You know me too well." They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, sipping their coffee and watching the world outside. For Rafael, it felt like the first moment of calm he'd had in a long time. "Do you ever wonder what's next?" Rafael asked after a while, his voice thoughtful. "I mean, now that the restaurant's gone, what do we do?" Clara looked at him, her expression serious but kind. "I think we start by figuring out what we want, what really matters to us." The restaurant was a huge part of your life, Rafael, but it wasn't the only part. You have so much more to offer the world. Rafael nodded slowly, her words sinking in. It was true, Flavors of the Heart had been his dream, but maybe it didn't have to be the only dream. Maybe, now that it was over, he had the chance to build something new, something different. Besides, Clara added with a smile, "You're not in this alone. I'm here. Anna and Luis are here. We've all been through this with you, and we're not going anywhere." Her words warmed him, like the first rays of sun breaking through after a long, dark night. The idea of starting over wasn't as terrifying as it had been before. In fact, the more he thought about it, the more excited he became at the possibilities. "What if," Rafael began, his mind racing with ideas, "we did something together? Something new? I don't know exactly what yet, but maybe we could create a space that's not just about food, but about stories, about people. Like what we saw happening at the restaurant in those last few days." Clara's eyes lit up, and she leaned forward. "I love that idea. Something that brings people together, just like before. But this time, we could focus on creating a real community. A place where people don't just come to eat, but to connect." Rafael felt his heart quicken with excitement. For the first time since the closure, he wasn't thinking about what he'd lost, but about what he could build. The idea of a fresh start, with Clara and the people who had stood by him, felt right. They spent the next hour brainstorming, throwing out ideas and getting lost in their shared vision for the future. The cafe buzzed with life around them, but for Rafael, the only thing that mattered was the hope that was slowly taking root inside him. By the time they finished their coffee, Rafael felt lighter than he had in weeks. As they walked out of the cafe, Clara looped her arm through his and smiled up at him. "This is just the beginning, Rafael," she said softly. "We're going to create something beautiful, together." Rafael looked down at her, feeling the weight of the past finally lift from his shoulders. "Yeah," he agreed, his voice filled with quiet determination. "Together." And for the first time in a long time, Rafael felt ready to let go of the past and embrace whatever the future held. Weeks had passed since the final closing of Flavors of the Heart. In that time, Rafael had begun to rediscover himself in ways he hadn't expected. The transition hadn't been easy. There were mornings when he woke up expecting to walk into his restaurant, to feel the familiar rush of preparing for the day's service, only to remember that part of his life had ended. But something new had taken root inside him, a feeling of possibility, a sense that his story was far from over. It was a warm afternoon when Rafael found himself back at the small cafe where he had met Clara weeks earlier. He sat by the window, staring out at the street, watching people go by with their busy lives. In front of him was a notebook filled with scribbled ideas, notes, and half-formed plans. He had started writing down everything that came to his mind, and though the future still felt uncertain, the act of writing it out gave him a sense of direction. The bell above the cafe door chimed, and Rafael glanced up to see Clara walking in, her smile as bright as ever. She waved to him before making her way over and dropping into the seat across from him. "All right, what have you got for me today?" she asked, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Rafael smiled, pushing the notebook toward her. "I've been thinking about what we talked about. You know, about creating something new, something that's not just a restaurant, but a community space." Clara opened the notebook and began flipping through the pages. Her eyes scanned the words, her expression thoughtful. This is good, Rafael. I like the idea of a place where people can come not just for food, but to share their stories. It's like what we saw with Anna. People crave connection, and that's what you do best." Rafael nodded, feeling more confident with every passing moment.
Exactly.
"And I've been thinking, what if we create a space where local artists, musicians, and storytellers can come and share their talents? We could host events, open mics, and even have a rotating menu that's inspired by the stories people tell." Clara looked up at him, her eyes filled with admiration. "I love it. It's everything Flavors of the Heart was, but with more focus on the community aspect. It's a fresh start, but it still holds on to what made your restaurant so special." Rafael felt warmth spread through his chest. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like he was trying to replace what he had lost. He was building something new, something that felt true to who he was now. Clara leaned back in her chair, a satisfied smile on her face. So, when do we start? Rafael chuckled softly, running a hand through his hair. Well, that's the tricky part, isn't it? We'll need a space and funding. There's still a lot to figure out. Clara waved a hand dismissively. We'll figure it out, one step at a time. You've got the vision, and the rest will come. Her unwavering confidence in him was something that always caught him off guard. Even when he doubted himself, Clara had a way of making him feel like anything was possible. I've been thinking about reaching out to some of the people who used to come to Flavors of the Heart, Rafael said after a pause. We had some regulars who were deeply connected to the place. Maybe they'd be willing to invest or help in some way. Clara nodded, her eyes lighting up. That's a great idea. We built something special there, and I know people would love to be a part of what comes next. They spent the next hour brainstorming, their excitement growing with each new idea they added to the mix. Rafael felt like he was on the cusp of something big, something that could be even more meaningful than the restaurant he had lost. And this time, he wasn't doing it alone. He had Clara by his side, just as she had been through the toughest moments of his life. As they wrapped up their meeting, Clara looked at him with a serious expression. You know, Rafael, I don't think I've ever really said this, but I'm proud of you. You've been through so much, and you could have just walked away from it all. But instead, you're choosing to rebuild. That takes a lot of courage. Her words hit him harder than he expected. He looked down at the table, emotions swelling in his chest. I couldn't have done any of this without you, he admitted, his voice quiet. You've always been there. Even when I felt like giving up. Clara smiled gently, her hand reaching across the table to cover his. That's what friends are for, right? For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, the weight of everything they had been through hanging between them. There was something unspoken in the air, a bond that had been forged in the fire of their shared struggles, something deeper than just friendship. Rafael wasn't sure where things would go from here, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. Later that evening, as Rafael walked through the quiet streets toward his apartment, he couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement bubbling up inside him. The future was still uncertain, but it no longer terrified him. There was something liberating about stepping into the unknown, about embracing the possibility of failure and success in equal measure. When he reached his apartment, he stood for a moment at the door, taking a deep breath before entering. The night was cool, and the stars twinkled above, casting a soft glow over the city. Rafael smiled to himself, a quiet sense of peace settling over him. As he stepped inside, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from Anna. He opened it and read the simple words. Thank you for everything, Rafael. You gave me and Luisa a home when we had nothing. Whatever you do next, I know it will be amazing. Let us know how we can help. Rafael's heart swelled as he read the message, his fingers hovering over the screen for a moment before typing a reply.
Thank you, Anna.
You and Luisa were the heart of the restaurant. I'll keep you posted on what's next. And trust me, it's going to be something special. He hit send and stared at the message for a moment, feeling a surge of determination. This was it, the beginning of something new. He didn't know where the journey would lead, but with Clara, Anna, and the rest of his community behind him, he was ready to take the first step. And whatever happened next, he knew it would be beautiful.